I remember the night I decided not to sleep. Not because I couldn't, but because I finally understood that something inside my home was quietly slipping away from me piece by piece. It wasn't anything big at first, nothing that would make a younger woman panic or call the police. No broken windows, no missing money, no signs of forced entry, just small things that didn't belong anywhere else but where I had left them. That night, I sat in my living room with the lights off, the old clock on the wall ticking louder than it ever had before. I had wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, though it wasn't cold. It was something else, something that made my hands feel uncertain. At 63, you begin to trust your routines more than your instincts. You tell yourself that forgetfulness is normal, that age plays tricks on memory, that you must have misplaced it. That's what I told myself for months, until I couldn't anymore. I live in a modest house at the end of a quiet street. It's the kind of place where nothing changes much. The same neighbor waters his plants at exactly 7 every morning. The same dog barks at the same delivery truck every Tuesday. Even the wind seems to pass through in familiar patterns. My husband passed away 8 years ago, a quiet man, steady, the kind who fixed things without needing to be asked. After he was gone, the house became still, not empty. I learned to fill it with small comforts. Morning tea in the kitchen by the window, soft music in the afternoon, the television murmuring in the evenings even when I wasn't really watching. My son Clark visits when he can. He lives about 40 minutes away with his wife Juliet. Juliet is polite. That's the word people would use. She smiles when she needs to, brings store-bought cakes and always says, "You shouldn't have made anything, really," even when I haven't. We've never argued, but we've never been close either. There's a distance with her that I've never quite been able to cross. Still, I told myself that was enough. Not every relationship needs warmth. Some simply exist, and that's all right. At least that's what I believed. The first thing that disappeared was my silver teaspoon. It was part of an old set I had kept since my wedding. Not expensive, but sentimental. I noticed it one morning when I was setting my tray for tea. There were supposed to be 6, there were 5. I stood there for a moment, counting again, then again. I checked the sink, the drawer. Even the small cabinet where I kept things I didn't use often. Nothing. I remember laughing softly to myself. "You're getting forgetful," I said out loud as if hearing it would make it true, so I let it go. A week later, it was my reading glasses. I always keep them on the side table next to my armchair. Always. It's a habit built over years. But that evening when I reached for them, they weren't there. I checked the kitchen, the bedroom, even the bathroom, though I never take them in there. I found them eventually. In the laundry room, sitting neatly on top of the washing machine, I remember standing there staring at them, feeling something small and sharp settle in my chest, because I knew I hadn't left them there. But again, I told myself the same thing. You're getting older. You must have forgotten. After that, it became a pattern, a scarf. Missing for 3 days, then found folded inside a drawer I rarely used. A small porcelain figurine from the shelf in the hallway, suddenly gone, then reappearing on the kitchen counter. Even my house keys once were not where I had placed them. I found them later in my coat pocket, a coat I hadn't worn in weeks. Each time I tried to reason with myself. Each time the explanation felt thinner, like a thread stretched too far. I didn't tell Clark. What would I say? That I was losing track of teaspoons and scarves? He would worry. Or worse, he would gently suggest that maybe I needed help, that maybe it was time to think about other arrangements. I wasn't ready for that. This house still felt like mine, even with the silence, even with the small, unsettling moments. Juliet started visiting more often around that time, not with Clark. Alone, she would call ahead sometimes. Other times, she would simply show up with a soft knock on the door and that same polite smile. "I was in the area," she would say. She would walk through the house slowly, her eyes moving over things in a way I couldn't quite understand. Not curious. Not exactly. Just observant. Once I noticed her pausing near the cabinet where I kept my tea set. "You have such lovely things," she said, running her fingers lightly along the edge of a cup. I smiled. "They've been with me a long time." She nodded but didn't say anything more. At the time, it didn't mean anything to me. It was just a moment, or so I thought. The unease began to settle in more deeply after an afternoon I can't seem to forget. Juliet had come by again, unexpected. We sat in the living room, the late sunlight stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines. She asked me questions that felt slightly misplaced. "Do you still keep all your valuables here?" she asked casually. I frowned, not understanding. Valuables, just important things, jewelry, documents. I laughed softly. "At my age, what valuables do you think I have?" She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Still," she said, "it's good to be careful." Something about the way she said it stayed with me long after she left. That evening, I decided to check, not because I suspected anything, not yet, but because something inside me needed reassurance. I went to the bedroom and opened the small wooden box where I kept my jewelry. Everything was there: my wedding ring, a pair of gold earrings, a delicate chain my husband had given me years ago, all exactly as I remembered. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Maybe I was imagining things, maybe it really was just age. But that night, as I sat in my armchair, the house felt different. Not empty, not quiet, but watched. I turned off the television and listened. The clock ticked, the wind brushed softly against the windows, and then something else, a faint sound. So soft I almost convinced myself it wasn't there. A creak, not from the walls, not from the pipes, from somewhere inside the house. I held my breath, listened, nothing, just silence again. I told myself it was the house settling. Old houses do that. They make sounds, they shift, they breathe. But as I sat there in the dim light, one thought refused to leave me. What if it wasn't the house? What if it wasn't me forgetting? What if someone had been here, not once, not twice, but over and over again, quietly, carefully, taking small things, moving others, testing how much I would notice, or how long it would take me to realize? That was the moment something inside me changed. A quiet decision, not dramatic, not loud, just firm. I would stop guessing, I would stop explaining it away. And I would find out the truth, even if I didn't like what I found. That's why, on that particular night, I made myself a cup of tea I never drank, turned off every light in the house, and sat in the dark, waiting. I had never been afraid of my own house before, not in all the years I had lived there. Not even after my husband passed, when the nights felt longer and the silence stretched in unfamiliar ways. But that night, sitting in the dark, listening instead of living, I felt like a guest in my own home. I chose the armchair by the window because it gave me a view of both the hallway and the front door. From there, I could see the outline of the kitchen entrance too, just beyond the corner. I didn't turn on a single light. Only the faint glow from the street lamp outside filtered through the curtains, casting thin, pale lines across the floor. The clock on the wall ticked with a patience that felt almost deliberate. Tick, tick, tick. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. It wasn't cold, but my fingers refused to stay still. I told myself I would sit there for an hour. Just 1 hour, long enough to prove that nothing was happening, long enough to calm the unease that had been building inside me for weeks. After that, I would go to bed, and in the morning, everything would feel smaller again, manageable, explainable. At first, there was nothing. Just the familiar sounds, the refrigerator humming softly in the kitchen, the faint whisper of wind brushing against the windows, a car passing somewhere far down the street. I found myself focusing on these things, clinging to them almost as if they could anchor me to reason. "You're imagining it," I told myself. "You've been alone too long. The mind plays tricks when it has too much silence to work with." I even smiled a little at that thought, but it didn't last. Because then I heard it again, that same sound, soft, careful, a creak. This time I didn't move, I didn't even breathe properly, I just listened. It came from the hallway, not loud enough to be obvious, but not faint enough to dismiss, like the weight of a step placed with intention. Slow, measured. My heart began to beat harder, not faster, just heavier, like each beat carried more weight than it should. I leaned forward slightly in my chair, my eyes fixed on the dark stretch of the hallway. Nothing, no shadow, no movement, just darkness. I waited, seconds passed, maybe minutes. Time began to stretch in that strange way it does when you're listening too closely. And then another sound, not a creak this time, a soft shift, like fabric brushing against something. It came from the kitchen. I felt it before I fully understood it. That realization, slow and heavy. Someone was there, inside my house. For a moment I considered calling out, "Hello," just to hear my own voice break the silence, just to make whatever was there reveal itself. But something stopped me, instinct maybe, or something quieter. Something that said, "Don't let them know you're here," so I stayed still, watching, listening. The kitchen was just out of full view from where I sat, but I could see the edge of the doorway. And then a shadow moved. Not fast, not sudden, just there. A shape passing slowly across the opening, my breath caught in my throat, sharp and silent. It was a person. There was no mistaking it. The outline was clear enough. A shoulder, the tilt of a head, the careful, deliberate movement of someone who believed they were alone. I felt something strange in that moment. Not panic, not yet, something colder, something more controlled, because suddenly everything made sense. The missing teaspoon, the glasses in the laundry room, the scarf, all of it, not forgetfulness, not age. Someone had been coming into my home, over and over again. And I had been explaining it away. The shadow moved again, this time slower, as if they were searching for something or deciding what to take next. I could hear the faintest sound of a drawer opening, careful, slow enough to avoid noise, but not slow enough to escape someone who was listening for it. My mind began to race, but my body stayed still. Who was it? How long had this been happening? Why take small things and then return some of them? It didn't feel like simple theft. It felt deliberate, like someone testing boundaries, or worse, playing with me. The figure stepped back into the hallway, closer now. I could see more clearly. The outline sharpened slightly in the dim light. A coat, a bag slung over one shoulder, and then the way they moved. That was what struck me the most, not unfamiliar. No, there was something about it, something I recognized. My chest tightened, because recognition in that moment was far more frightening than the unknown. They paused right there in the hallway, as if listening, as if sensing something. I pressed myself deeper into the chair, willing my presence to disappear into the darkness. The clock ticked. Loud, too loud. I wondered if they could hear it the way I could, if it was giving me away. And then they turned, not toward the front door, but toward the living room, toward me. For a second I thought they would see me, that the thin veil of darkness wouldn't be enough, that this quiet, careful watching would end in something louder, something harder to control. But they didn't step forward, they just stood there, still. And then, slowly, they reached into their bag. I watched as they pulled something out, small, metal. They walked to the side table near the wall, the one by the hallway, and placed it down, gently, with care, as if returning something borrowed. My breath left me in a slow, silent release, because I knew what it was before I even saw it clearly. My teaspoon, the missing one. They stood there for a moment longer, then turned back toward the hallway, and began to walk slowly toward the back of the house. That's when I realized something that made my skin go cold. They weren't leaving. There is a particular kind of fear that doesn't scream, it doesn't make you run, it doesn't even make you move. It just settles in your bones and waits. That's what I felt as I sat there, listening to the soft retreat of their footsteps, because whoever this person was, they knew the house well enough to move in the dark. They weren't searching for the exit. They were going deeper inside, toward the bedrooms. I thought of my room, the small wooden jewelry box, the wardrobe, the drawers, things that still held pieces of my life, memories, moments, proof that I had lived here fully. And someone was walking toward them as if they had a right to be there. I couldn't stay still anymore, not this time. The fear shifted, not louder, but sharper, focused. I stood up slowly from the chair, careful not to let it creak beneath me. Every movement felt heavier than it should, like the air itself was resisting. I stepped forward, one foot, then the other, my eyes fixed on the dark hallway. The house, which had always felt like a place of safety, now felt like a map I had to navigate carefully. Every board I stepped on, I knew, every place that might make a sound, I moved around them instinctively, quietly as the person ahead of me. I reached the hallway, paused, listened. A faint sound came from my bedroom, the soft slide of something being opened. My heart pressed hard against my chest, but I kept moving. When I reached the doorway, I stopped just for a moment. Because I needed to see clearly, not guess, not assume, but know. The door was slightly open, just enough for me to see inside, and there, standing near my dresser, was Juliet. She wasn't rushing, she wasn't panicked, she was calm, focused. As if she had done this before. Her bag was open on the bed, my jewelry box was in her hands, and she was carefully, quietly choosing what to take. Something inside me didn't break, it didn't shatter, it just settled. Like a truth finally finding its place. I pushed the door open, slowly, deliberately. She turned, her eyes met mine, and for a moment neither of us spoke. For a moment the room held its breath. Juliet's hand was still inside my jewelry box. Mine rested against the door I had just pushed open. Neither of us moved, neither of us spoke. It's strange how silence can carry more weight than words. How, in a single still moment, everything that has been hidden begins to arrange itself into something undeniable. She didn't look surprised. That was the first thing I noticed. Not startled, not frightened, just caught, and there is a difference. A startled person drops things, steps back, makes noise. Juliet did none of that. She simply looked at me, her fingers slowly withdrawing from the box as if she had been interrupted mid-thought rather than mid-act. "I was going to tell you," she said. Her voice was calm, too calm. It slid into the room like it belonged there. I closed the door behind me, not loudly, just enough to seal the space. "Tell me what?" I asked. My voice didn't shake. I expected it to, but it didn't. It came out quiet, measured, controlled in a way I didn't recognize as my own. Her eyes flickered toward the jewelry in her hand, then back to me. "This isn't what it looks like." I let out a soft breath through my nose. That sentence, it always arrives, doesn't it? No matter the situation, as if words alone can reshape what is already visible. "What does it look like, Juliet?" I asked. She hesitated just a fraction, long enough. "It looks like you're in my bedroom," I continued, going through my things in the middle of the night. She placed the necklace she had been holding back into the box, carefully. Almost respectfully. "I didn't want to wake you," she said. The absurdity of that settled somewhere deep inside me, not loud enough to laugh, but sharp enough to feel. "You didn't want to wake me," I repeated. She nodded slightly as if that explained something, as opposed to asking me. I added, her jaw tightened just a little. "I knew you'd say no." There it was, not apology, not denial, just reasoning. I stepped further into the room. The floorboard creaked softly beneath my foot this time, but neither of us reacted to it. Because the real noise was already between us. "You've been coming here," I said, not a question, a statement. Her eyes held mine. For a second I thought she might deny it, but she didn't. "Yes," she said, simple, direct, like admitting to something small. "How long?" I asked. She looked down briefly, then back up. A few months." The words settled slowly like dust, covering everything I thought I understood. "The teaspoon," I said. She gave a small nod. "The glasses," another nod. "The scarf." "Yes." Each answer landed softly, too softly, as if we were discussing misplaced items over tea, not a quiet invasion of my home. "Why?" I asked. That was the only word that mattered now, not what, not when, but why. She exhaled slowly, shifting her weight slightly. "I needed things," she said. "What things?" I asked. Her gaze flickered toward the jewelry box again. "Valuable things." I stared at her, not in disbelief, but in a kind of quiet observation, because I wasn't just hearing her words, I was watching how easily they came. "You needed them," I repeated. "Yes. For what?" She hesitated again, longer this time, and for the first time since I had walked in, I saw something change in her expression. Not guilt, not quite, but something closer to discomfort. "Money," she said finally. The word hung between us, plain, unadorned. "Clark knows?" I asked. Her reaction was immediate. "No, too quick, too sharp." I nodded slowly. Of course he didn't, because if he had, this wouldn't be happening in the quiet shadows of my house. "So instead," I said gently, "you decided to come here at night, into my home, into my room." She didn't respond. "You took things," I continued, "and then returned some of them." Her eyes shifted again. "I didn't want you to notice right away." There it was, the truth laid out with unsettling clarity. I felt something inside me settle again, not anger, not yet, something steadier, something colder. "You were testing me," I said. She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. I walked past her slowly toward the dresser. My movements were calm, deliberate, as if I were moving through a room I had just discovered for the first time. I looked at the open bag on my bed. Inside, I could see a few familiar things: a small brooch, one of my rings, a folded scarf. Not everything, just enough. "How many times?" I asked, still looking at the bag. She sighed quietly. "I don't know." I turned to face her. "You don't know?" "It wasn't like I was counting," she said, a slight edge creeping into her voice now. That was the first crack, small, but there. I held her gaze. "And you thought I wouldn't notice." She crossed her arms lightly. "I thought you'd forget." The words landed harder than anything she had said before, not because they were louder, but because they were honest. I nodded once. "Yes," I said softly. "I suppose you did." There was a pause, long enough for something else to surface, something deeper than the act itself. "You think I'm what?" I asked quietly. "Old." She didn't answer. Confused, I continued. "Still nothing? Forgetful enough to live in a house that isn't mine anymore?" Her lips pressed together. "I see the way you look at things when you come here," I said. "The way your eyes move, the way you ask questions that don't belong in polite conversation." She shifted again, uncomfortable now. "You're making this into something it's not." I let out a small breath. No, I said, I think I'm finally seeing it for what it is. Silence filled the room again, but it felt different now, not heavy, not uncertain. Just clear. I walked to the bed and gently closed her bag, then I picked it up and handed it to her. She looked at it, then at me, confused. Take it, I said. She didn't move. Aren't you going to, she started, call the police? I finished. She nodded slightly. I shook my head. No, her confusion deepened. Why not? I met her eyes. Because this isn't about the things, I said. It never was. She frowned. This, I continued, gesturing lightly around the room, is about something much smaller. She didn't understand. I could see it. It's about what you thought of me, I said. About what you believed you could do without consequence. Her expression hardened slightly. I needed help. Then you should have asked, I replied. I knew you'd say no. You didn't give me the chance to say anything. Another pause. I stepped back toward the door. You should go, I said. She stared at me just like that. Yes. And Clark, she asked. I opened the door. That, I said quietly, is something we'll talk about soon. She hesitated for a moment longer, then picked up her bag, walked past me, and left the room. I stood there for a long time after she was gone, not moving, not thinking in any clear way, just standing. The house felt different again, but not in the way it had before. The fear was gone, in its place something steadier. Something that understood exactly what had happened, and what needed to happen next. Because this wasn't just about Juliet, and it wasn't just about what she had taken. It was about the quiet way someone had tried to rewrite my place in my own life. And that I would not allow. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid anymore, but because something inside me had shifted and sleep felt like a luxury I hadn't earned yet. I sat at the edge of my bed long after Juliet left, the faint imprint of her presence still lingering in the room. The jewelry box was closed now, back in its place, but it didn't feel the same. Nothing did. I kept replaying the moment in my mind. The way she stood there, the way she spoke, not like someone who had crossed a line, but like someone who had quietly erased it. By morning, the house returned to its usual rhythm. The kettle whistled. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window. The neighbor watered his plants at exactly 7. Everything looked the same. But it was. I moved through my routine carefully, aware of each small action, the placement of my cup, the sound of the spoon against the porcelain, the exact spot where I set my keys. For the first time in months, I wasn't doubting myself. I knew where things belonged, and I knew who had been moving them. I didn't call Clark right away. That might seem strange, but when you've lived long enough, you learn that timing matters more than truth sometimes. Not in the sense of hiding things, but in the sense of letting them unfold properly. Clark loved Juliet. That much was clear. He had built a life with her, piece by piece, believing in something steady. I wasn't going to shatter that in a moment of anger. No. If this was going to be addressed, it would be done with clarity, with dignity, not with noise. Instead, I began to pay attention, not to the house, but to them. Juliet didn't come by for 3 days. That in itself was unusual. She had grown comfortable with her visits, familiar, almost entitled to the space. Her absence felt intentional, like someone waiting to see what the next move would be. On the 4th day, Clark called. Hey, Mom, he said, his voice warm, easy. I closed my eyes for a moment when I heard it. That same voice I had known since he was small. The same softness that used to call for me in the middle of the night. Hello, Clark, I replied. We spoke about ordinary things at first. The weather. His work, a neighbor who had been making too much noise lately. Small, safe topics, but underneath it all I could feel it. The distance, not in love but in awareness he didn't know, and that made every word heavier. Juliet said she hasn't seen you in a few days, he added casually. I stirred my tea slowly. No, I said, she hasn't come by. A pause. Is everything okay? He asked. There it was, that gentle concern, the one that always comes before something deeper. Yes, I said, and then after a moment I added, Clark, I think it's time we had dinner together. He hesitated slightly. Of course, he said, we can come by this weekend. No, I replied softly, I'd like to come to your place. Another pause. Longer this time? Okay, he said finally, that sounds good. We settled on Sunday evening, 3 days away, 3 days that felt longer than they should have. In those days I prepared, not in the way you might think. I didn't gather evidence, I didn't set traps. I didn't even check the house again. There was no need. I already knew the truth. What I needed was clarity in myself, in what I would say, in how I would say it, because this wasn't just about exposing Juliet. It was about something more delicate. Protecting what remained of my relationship with my son. Sunday arrived quietly. I chose my clothes with care, nothing dramatic, nothing that would suggest confrontation, just something simple, something that felt like me. When I arrived, Clark opened the door with that same familiar smile. "Mom," he said, pulling me into a brief, warm hug. His home smelled like something cooking. Garlic, butter, comfort. For a moment I let myself feel it, that normalcy, that illusion of everything being as it should. Juliet appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. Her expression shifted when she saw me, just slightly, but enough. "Hi," she said, polite, measured as always. "Hello, Juliet," I replied. Dinner was calm, too calm. We sat at the table, plates neatly arranged, glasses filled. Clark spoke the most, about work, about plans. About things that didn't matter in that moment. Juliet added small comments here and there, but she was quieter than usual, careful, watching me when she thought I wouldn't notice. I waited, not because I was unsure, but because moments like this, they require the right space. The right breath. It came after dessert, when the plates had been cleared, when the room had settled into that soft, post-meal silence. I placed my hands gently on the table. "Clark," I said. He looked up. "Yes." I turned my gaze to Juliet. Then back to him. "There's something I need to talk to you about." He sat back slightly, concern flickering across his face. "What is it?" I took a slow breath, not to steady myself, but to make sure the words came out exactly as they needed to. "Juliet has been coming into my house at night," I said. The silence that followed was immediate, complete. Clark blinked once, as if the words hadn't settled properly. "I'm sorry, what?" Juliet didn't move. "For months," I continued gently, "small things have been disappearing from my home." Clark looked at Juliet, then back at me, confusion now mixing with disbelief. "Mom, that doesn't—" "I stayed awake one night," I said, "and I saw her." The room shifted, not physically but emotionally. The air changed. Clark turned fully toward Juliet now. "Juliet?" She didn't speak. "Tell me that's not true," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried something heavier now, something closer to hurt. Juliet exhaled slowly. And then she nodded. It was small, but it was enough. Clark leaned back in his chair as if something had physically pushed him. What are you saying?" he asked. She looked at him. "I needed money," she said, the same words. The same calm tone. "And this was your solution?" he asked, still not raising his voice, but the disbelief was clear now. "I didn't take much," she said. "I returned things." Clark let out a hollow laugh. "You returned things." I watched him carefully, not as a mother watching her son, but as someone witnessing a moment that would change something fundamental. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked her. She didn't answer immediately, and in that silence, the truth deepened. "I knew how you'd react," she said finally. Clark shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "you didn't trust me enough to find out." That landed. Even Juliet felt it. The room fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't uncertain, it was clear, painfully so. I stood up slowly. "I didn't come here to fight," I said. "I came here because this needed to be seen clearly by all of us." Clark looked at me, his eyes softer now, but heavy. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said. I gave him a small, gentle nod. "I know." Then I turned to Juliet, and for the first time there was no confusion left between us, only understanding. "This isn't about what you took," I said quietly. "It's about what you believed you could take from me without asking." She didn't respond. I picked up my bag and moved toward the door. Behind me I could feel it. The beginning of something difficult, not loud, not dramatic, but real. And sometimes that's the hardest kind of truth to face. I didn't stay to hear what came next. Some things don't belong to you, even when you're part of them. As I stepped out of their house, I could feel the weight of what I had left behind pressing quietly against my back. Not shouting, not breaking, just shifting. The evening air was cool, softer than I expected. It carried the faint scent of damp earth and something blooming nearby. I stood there for a moment on the walkway, my hand resting lightly on the gate, letting myself feel it. Not relief, not sadness alone, something more complicated, something that comes when truth finally settles into place. The drive home was quiet, no radio, no distractions. Just the steady hum of the engine and my thoughts moving slowly, carefully, like they had learned not to rush anymore. I didn't replay the conversation. I didn't need to, it had already carved its place inside me. What mattered now was what would follow. When I reached home, the house greeted me the way it always had. Still, familiar, waiting, but this time there was no unease, no sense of being watched, no quiet questions lingering in the corners. It felt like mine again, fully. I placed my keys in their usual spot. Took off my shoes, moved through the rooms without hesitation. There is a certain kind of peace in knowing where everything belongs and knowing it will still be there when you return. I hadn't realized how much that had been taken from me, not the objects, but the certainty. That night I slept, not deeply, but honestly, and that was enough. The next morning Clark called. I had expected it, not immediately, but soon. His name appeared on my phone just as I was finishing my tea. I let it ring once, twice, not out of hesitation, but to gather myself into the right kind of quiet. Then I answered. "Hello, Clark." His voice was different, still my son, but heavier. "I'm sorry, Mom." The words came quickly this time, not like before, not polite. Not measured, just real. I closed my eyes briefly. "I know," I said. There was a pause on his end, longer than usual. "I didn't know," he added. "I believe you." And I did, because the shock in his face the night before, that wasn't something you could pretend. "We talked," he said. "I didn't ask for details. If he wanted to tell me, he would. She said she's been struggling," he continued. "With money, with things she didn't want to tell me." I listened, quietly. "She said it started small," he added. "That she thought she'd fix it before anyone noticed." I looked down at my cup, the faint swirl of tea leaves at the bottom. "Yes," I said softly. "That sounds familiar." There was a shift in his breathing, a hesitation. "Mom, she says she didn't mean to hurt you." I let that sit between us for a moment, not rejecting it, not accepting it entirely either. "Intent doesn't always change the result, Clark," I said gently. "I know," he replied, "and I'm not defending what she did." Another pause. "She's ashamed." That word, it carries weight, but not always the kind that repairs things. Sometimes it comes after the damage is already done. "What happens now?" I asked, not as a demand, just as a quiet question. He exhaled slowly. "I don't know yet. Honest, I need time to think." "That's wise," I said. There was something else he wanted to say. I could hear it in the way he stayed on the line, in the silence he didn't quite fill. "Mom," he began. "Yes." "Are you all right?" I thought about that, not quickly, not automatically. I let the question settle properly. "Yes," I said finally. "I am," and for the first time since all of this began, it felt true. After we hung up, I sat there for a while, not doing anything in particular, just being. Over the next few days, the house remained unchanged. No missing items, no misplaced objects, no quiet disturbances in the night. The rhythm had returned. But I hadn't returned to who I was before. Something had shifted in me, not broken, not hardened, just clarified. I began to notice things differently, not with suspicion, but with awareness. The way people speak when they think you're not paying attention. The assumptions hidden inside small, casual words. The quiet ways respect can slip without anyone naming it. Juliet didn't contact me, not directly, but I knew she was thinking about it. People always do when silence stretches long enough. A week later, Clark came by, alone. I saw him through the window before he knocked, standing there for a moment as if preparing himself, the same way I had before going to his house. When I opened the door, he looked older, not in years, but in understanding. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Hello, Clark." We did hug right away, not out of distance, but because something needed to settle first. He stepped inside, looked around briefly, as if seeing the house with new eyes. "Everything looks the same," he said. "Yes," I replied, "it is." But we both knew that wasn't entirely true. We sat in the living room, the same place I had sat that night, the same chair, the same clock ticking quietly on the wall. "I've been thinking," he said. "I imagined you have," I replied. He leaned forward, resting his hands together. "I can't ignore what she did." "No," I said, "you can't. But I also can't pretend I don't know her," he added. "She's not a bad person." I nodded slowly. "I never said she was." And I meant that because people are rarely just one thing. "She made a choice," I continued. "A series of them. That's what I keep coming back to," he said. "The fact that it wasn't just once." We sat with that for a moment. "She wants to apologize to you," he said. I looked at him. "Does she understand what she's apologizing for?" He hesitated. "I think so." I shook my head gently. "No," I said. "Thinking isn't the same as knowing." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I leaned back in my chair. "She didn't just take things, Clark," I said. "She entered my home over and over again, believing she had the right to." He looked down. "She believed I wouldn't notice," I continued. That I wasn't present enough anymore. His jaw tightened. I know, I said softly. This isn't about you. Another silence, but not uncomfortable, just necessary. Do you want to see her? He asked. I considered that carefully, not emotionally, but honestly. Not yet, I said. He nodded. I understand. And I think in that moment he truly did. We spoke a little longer about smaller things, gentler things, not to avoid the truth, but to remind ourselves that not everything had been taken from us. When he left, he hugged me, tighter than before, longer. And as I closed the door behind him, I realized something quietly important. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of understanding who people really are when no one is watching. And what you choose to do once you've seen it. In the days that followed, the quiet returned, but it wasn't the same quiet I had known before. It was no longer filled with uncertainty. It had edges now, clear ones. Defined by what I had seen, what I had understood, and what I would no longer ignore. I moved through my home with a steadiness that felt new even to me, not cautious, not guarded, just aware. There is a difference. When something is taken from you without your knowledge, it leaves a kind of invisible gap, not in the space itself, but in your trust of it. And when that trust is broken quietly, it doesn't shatter, it fades. I began to rebuild it in small ways. I rearranged the drawer where I kept my cutlery, not because it needed it, but because I wanted to place things there myself intentionally. I polished the silver teaspoons, including the one that had gone missing and returned like it had never left. I didn't rush it. Each motion was deliberate, a quiet reclaiming. I also changed the locks, not dramatically, not with urgency, but with purpose. A locksmith came one morning, a polite man with steady hands who asked very few questions. I appreciated that. He worked quietly, efficiently, replacing what needed to be replaced. When he handed me the new set of keys, they felt heavier in my palm, not physically, but symbolically. A boundary restored. Clark called again that evening. I told him about the locks. There was a pause on the line. I understand, he said. I wasn't asking for permission, I replied gently. I know, he said. You shouldn't have to. He sounded tired, not in body but in mind. There's a kind of exhaustion that comes when something you believed in begins to unravel. You don't just lose the situation. You lose the version of reality you were holding onto. How is she? I asked. I hadn't meant to, but the question came anyway. He took a moment to answer. She's quiet, he said. More than usual. I could picture it, not as punishment. Not as performance, just the natural weight of consequence settling in. She wants to come with me next time, he added. I didn't respond immediately. I'm not asking you to forgive her, he continued. Just to hear her. I closed my eyes for a moment. Not to escape the question, but to meet it honestly. All right, I said, but not in my house. Another pause. Where then? He asked. A cafe, I replied. Somewhere neutral. He agreed, and we chose a small place not far from my street. Quiet, simple, the kind of place where conversations can exist without echoing. The day we met, I arrived early, not out of nervousness, but out of preference. I like to sit in a place before others arrive to understand its rhythm. The cafe smelled of fresh coffee and warm bread. There was a low hum of conversation, soft music playing somewhere in the background, nothing intrusive, nothing overwhelming. I chose a table by the window, ordered tea, and waited. When they arrived, I saw them before they saw me. Clark walked slightly ahead. Juliet followed a step behind, not distant, but not quite beside him either. That small space between them, it said more than anything they might have spoken. They approached the table. Clark gave me a small, tentative smile. Juliet didn't, not immediately. Mom, he said. Hello, Clark. Then I looked at her. Juliet. She nodded. Thank you for meeting me. Her voice was softer than I had ever heard it, not weak, but stripped of its usual certainty. We sat, the three of us, at a table that held more than just cups and plates. For a moment, no one spoke. The waiter came, orders were placed, and then the silence returned. Juliet was the one who broke it. I'm sorry, she said, no explanation, no preface, just those two words. I watched her carefully, not for the words, but for what stood behind them. I know what I did was wrong, she continued. I know I crossed a line. I tilted my head slightly. A line, I repeated. She nodded. No, I said gently. You crossed a boundary? She looked at me, unsure. A line, I explained, can be stepped over by accident. A boundary requires a decision. She swallowed, and for the first time I saw something closer to understanding in her eyes. I made the wrong decisions, she said. Yes, I replied, you did. Clark shifted slightly in his seat, not uncomfortable, just present, listening. I wasn't thinking clearly, she added. I was overwhelmed and I thought, you thought I wouldn't notice, I said. She stopped. Yes, she admitted. And when I didn't, I continued, you kept going. She lowered her gaze. The truth, when spoken plainly, has a way of settling into people more deeply than any raised voice ever could. I didn't see you that way before, she said quietly. That caught my attention. Before, I asked. She hesitated. I didn't understand how much you still noticed, she said. There it was, not cruel, not even intentional, but honest. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said, I gathered that. She looked up again. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I believe that, I replied, and yet you did. Another silence, but this one felt different, less defensive, more real. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said. That's good, I replied, because forgiveness isn't something you request. Clark looked at me, surprised by the firmness in my tone. It's something that comes, I continued, when understanding has had time to grow. Juliet nodded slowly. I just wanted you to hear it from me, she said. I have, I replied. We sat there for a while longer, not discussing the past in detail, not reopening every moment, because sometimes repeating the truth doesn't deepen it, it only exhausts it. When we stood to leave, Juliet hesitated, then she said, thank you, not for forgiveness, not for acceptance, just for the space to speak. And I respected that. As I walked home afterward, I realized something quietly important. Closure doesn't always come with resolution. Sometimes it comes with clarity, and that is enough to move forward. After that meeting, life did not return to what it had been before, and I didn't expect it to. There is a quiet misunderstanding people often carry that once something is spoken, once an apology is given, things can simply be placed back where they were. But life doesn't work that way. Not at this age, not after something has been seen so clearly. What changed was not the house, not the routine, but the way I understood the people within it, and perhaps the way I understood myself. Clark continued to visit, at first more often than before, not out of obligation, but out of something closer to responsibility. Or maybe a quiet guilt he hadn't yet found words for. I didn't mention it. I didn't need to. Some things are better left unnamed, allowed to settle on their own. He would come by in the afternoon sometimes. We would sit in the living room just as we always had, tea between us, the clock ticking softly, but there was a new layer to our conversations, not tension, not distance, just awareness. I should have noticed something was wrong, he said one day, staring into his cup. I shook my head gently. People don't always show their struggles in ways that are easy to see. But still, he insisted, I live with her, I should have known. I looked at him for a moment before responding. Knowing someone, I said, is not the same as seeing everything they choose to hide. He nodded slowly, but I could tell he was still carrying it, that quiet weight. Juliet did not come with him, not at first, and I didn't ask her to. Not because I was angry, but because space, when used properly, can be more honest than forced closeness. Weeks passed, slowly, naturally, the kind of passing time that doesn't demand attention but still changes things. Then one afternoon, Clark stood by the door a little longer than usual before leaving. She's been trying, he said. I looked at him. In what way? She's been looking for work again, he said. She's been more open with me about things. I nodded. That's good. He hesitated. She also sold some of her things, he added, to return what she took. That caught my attention, not because of the money, but because of the intention behind it. She didn't need to do that, I said. I think she needed to, he replied. We stood there for a moment, the space between us filled with something quieter than approval, something closer to acknowledgement. Would it be all right, he began carefully, if she came with me next time? I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel the question fully before responding. Yes, I said finally. His shoulders relaxed slightly. Thank you. The next visit was different, subtle but unmistakably so. Juliet stood beside him this time, not behind, not ahead. Beside, when I opened the door, she met my eyes directly, not with confidence, but with intention. Hello, she said. Hello, Juliet, I replied. There was no hesitation in letting them in, no resistance, just a quiet acceptance of where things were now. We sat together. The same 3 seats, the same room, but the atmosphere had shifted. Juliet spoke less than before, but when she did, it felt more considered, more grounded. I found a position at a small office, she said at one point. Part-time. That's good, I said. And I meant it. I've also been organizing things, she added. At home. I understood what she meant, not just physical things, but the structure of her life. Clark listened, quietly but with a different kind of attention, not passive, not assumed, present. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no emotional dejulietations, just conversation, measured, real. At one point, Juliet looked around the room, the same way she used to, but differently now. You've kept everything so steady, she said. I followed her gaze, the familiar furniture, the photographs. The small details that had remained unchanged over the years. Yes, I said, I suppose I have. She nodded. I didn't understand that before. I looked at her, and for the first time I believed her, because understanding doesn't always come with words. Sometimes it comes with how someone carries themselves afterward. When they left that day, Juliet paused at the door. Thank you for letting me come, she said. You're welcome, I replied, and that was enough. After they were gone, I returned to the living room. Sat in my chair and listened. Not for creaks, not for movement, just for the quiet. It was steady, unbroken. I realized then that what had been taken from me was not just trust, but something smaller, more delicate, the assumption that people see you clearly. And what had been returned was not just objects, but something deeper, the understanding that clarity must come from within, not from others. I didn't rush to forgive Juliet. I didn't deny her effort either. I simply allowed things to be what they were. Because forgiveness, like trust, is not something you decide in a moment. It is something that grows or it doesn't. And either way, you learn to live with the truth of it. That evening, as I prepared my tea, I reached for one of the silver teaspoons. The same set, the same 6. I paused for a moment, holding one in my hand, not because I was afraid it would disappear again, but because I understood now how easily small things can be taken and how quietly they can be returned. I placed it gently into the cup, watched the steam rise, and allowed myself a small, quiet breath. Not everything had been restored, but enough had, and sometimes enough is all you need.